July 27, 2024. The west face of K2. The two finest climbers on the planet had just fallen from the wall, and with them, the mountain's death toll quietly ticked past 90. K2 is not the tallest mountain on Earth. It is not the most crowded, and it is not the most photographed. It is simply one of the deadliest, a peak so severe that surviving the long way back down is considered one of the hardest things a human being can do. You would expect the people it kills to be remembered, the huge storms are, the chaotic headline seasons are, but most of the climbers who die up here slip away quietly, one at a time, in the margins of somebody else's story, and almost none of their names survive. And here is the part I keep coming back to. These deaths are not random, one-off tragedies. They are a chain. The same quiet mistake made in the same quiet moment, again and again across nearly 40 years. This is the story of 5 of the loneliest deaths on the deadliest mountain on Earth. Welcome to Tourist Tragedies. It begins in 1986 with a man who survived absolutely everything K2 could throw at him and then died anyway, 1 hour from a hot drink. Renato Casarotto was one of the greatest solo climbers who ever lived. He had soloed the north face of Huascaran over 17 days, made the first solo of Fitzroy's North Pillar, and named it after his wife, and crossed the Freinet trilogy on Mont Blanc in the dead of winter. His weapon was patience, and it had kept him alive for 20 years. In 1986, his obsession was the Magic Line, the unclimbed south-southwest ridge, the last great unsolved problem on the mountain. He threw himself at it 3 times, and on his final push reached around 8,300 meters, perhaps 300 vertical meters below the summit. Then, being the disciplined man he was, he looked at the weather and turned around. He chose to live. Alone and exhausted, he downclimbed the entire ridge flawlessly, and walked off the bottom of the climb onto the glacier that stood between him and base camp. The hardest part was behind him. He was crossing that glacier no more than an hour's walk from the tents when a hidden bridge of snow collapsed under his boots and he dropped roughly 40 meters into a crevasse, a crack in the ice as deep as a 12-story building is tall. Incredibly, he survived the fall, and by pure chance, the great mountaineer Kurt Diemberger had told Casarotto's wife, Greta, to keep her radio switched on. So, he dug his set out with broken hands and whispered to her, down at base camp, that he was dying. Climbers from 3 different expeditions dropped everything, ran out onto the glacier, found the hole, and hauled him back up into the daylight alive. And then he tried to stand, too. He took a few steps, and he collapsed, dead of massive internal injuries no rescue on that ice could ever have fixed. At Greta's wish, he was laid to rest inside the same crevasse. 17 years later, the shifting glacier gave his body back, and a passing team carried him to the memorial cairn. He beat the death zone and died on a walk across the flats. That very same summer, on the other side of the mountain, another quiet death happened just weeks earlier. And it is doubly forgotten, because it sits in the shadow of both a famous storm and a famous partner. Tadeusz Piotrowski was one of the original Polish ice warriors, arguably the finest winter mountaineer of his day, a man who had made the first winter ascent of a 7,000-meter peak years before. In July of 1986, he and the legendary Jerzy Kukuczka pulled off something that has still never been repeated in the nearly 40 years since. The first ascent of K2's brutally steep south face, a line Reinhold Messner himself had judged too dangerous to attempt. They climbed it alpine style, with almost no food or gear, and topped out late in the day. For Kukuczka, it was his 11th peak above 8,000 meters. It was one of the greatest new routes in the history of the mountain, but the face was far too steep to reverse, which meant they had no choice but to descend an unfamiliar ridge on the far side, with no idea what was below them. That descent is where it went wrong. Darkness forced them to bivouac at 8,300 meters with no tent and no sleeping bags, and the next full day they managed to grope down only a few hundred meters through the thin air. On the 3rd day, feeling their way down in bad weather on ice as hard as glass, near the very spot where Art Gilkey had died in 1953, it happened in seconds. One of Piotrowski's crampons slipped off his boot. Then, the other one flew off too. With nothing left to grip the ice, he slid straight down into Kukuchka, who could not hold him, and he disappeared over the edge. He had reportedly left the rope behind at the bivouac, so there was nothing to clip into, nothing to stop the fall. Kukuchka, alone and shattered, took more than 5 hours to climb down the final 200 meters to a tent, and then slept for almost a full day. The greatest rout in K2's history and one of its cruelest deaths happened inside the same 48 hours, and almost no one outside Poland ever tells the second half. Now jump forward to 1994, the forgotten season. Wedged between two disasters everyone does remember, the storm of 1986 and the chaos of 1995. It quietly held two separate tragedies that eerily collided. First, a Ukrainian team, led by a climber named Vadim Sviridenko, was caught by a sudden change in the weather high on their summit push, and 3 of their climbers never came back down. They had gone up into a good forecast and simply vanished into it. Teammates later found 2 frozen bodies near 8,400 meters, and then a German team found something worse near the bottleneck, the steep, deadly gully just below the summit, a single severed leg, jammed into the snow beside the fixed rope. That one grim detail became part of a second death. Steve Untch was a big, exuberant American, a caver and kayaker and big wall climber, the kind of man friends said would have sailed with explorers in another century. He summited K2 on July 23rd, and by all rights it should have been the proudest achievement of his life. It became instead the beginning of the last 4 days of it. Days later, while descending, Untch came upon that same severed leg beside the fixed rope, an image his expedition leader wrote had nearly made him sick. And then, on July 26th, Untch was helping an injured Australian climber named Michael Groom down off the mountain. Groom had a leg injury and frostbite and could barely move under his own power. Untch carried the man's pack and belayed him down the hardest sections, past a notorious rock chimney low on the route, and then, in the middle of getting somebody else to safety, a fixed rope broke and Untch fell to his death. Think about that for a second. He did not die chasing his own summit or taking a gamble for himself. He died in the act of lowering an injured friend towards safety, unable to save himself in the process. As one tribute to him put it, he died rushing to help someone else. 5 people died on K2 that single summer. And the season barely registers in the popular histories at all. It has no name, no famous book, no anniversary. Almost nobody tells either half of the story. Which brings us back to the man who asked for the lamp. Stefano Zavka was Umbria's first ever mountain guide, a ski mountaineer and former racing cyclist who came to the Great Mountains relatively late in life. His K2 story has a haunting prologue. In 2004, on the Italian expedition marking the 50th anniversary of the mountain's first ascent, 5 porters were killed on the approach before the climbing had even begun, and Zavka, badly shaken, turned back 400 meters short of the summit, then helped rescue a frostbitten teammate, the Basque climber Juanito Oyarzabal, on the way down. He came home shaken. He called the whole experience beautiful, but so stressful that the effort had outweighed the joy. He came back in 2007 anyway. This time, he and his partner Mario Vielmo reached the summit, but very late in the day, close to 7 in the evening, which on a mountain like this is dangerously fatally late. On the way down, Zavka began to suffer frostbite, and he urged Vielmo to go on ahead without him. That decision split the 2 men apart on the mountain. Vielmo continued down toward Camp 4. An American climber, Don Bowie, had photographed the 2 Italians together near the bottleneck a little earlier, and it would turn out to be one of the last images of Zavka alive. When Vielmo looked back up into the gathering dark, he could no longer see his partner anywhere on the slope. That evening, Zavka was somewhere close to the tents, but he could not find them in the poor weather, and so he keyed his radio and asked a teammate to light a lamp inside a tent so he could steer toward the glow. It is believed he may have gotten agonizingly close, but he never reached the light. The team searched, then descended without him the following day, and his body has never been found. Later, accounts described a preventable death, and the aftermath fueled a lasting argument about the every man for himself ethic above 8,000 meters, where a struggling climber can simply be left behind to fend for himself. An asteroid was later named in his honor, a small point of light out in the dark of space, for a man who died trying to reach one. The last story is the most recent, and in some ways the most stunning, because it took the two best climbers on the mountain. Kazuya Hiraide was perhaps the most respected alpinist in Japan, one of only 3 people ever to win 4 or more Piolet d'Or, the highest honor in the sport. He was famous for hunting obscure, unclimbed lines far from any crowd, faces on peaks like Shisper and Rakaposhi that he chased for as long as a decade, almost always with his partner Kenro Nakajima, a former cameraman whose own father, also a climber, had died when Nakajima was just 5. Hiraide had actually summited Everest 3 times, but he refused to even talk about it, because on the giant commercial peaks he had been there working as a cameraman, not chasing his own dream. His real dream, stated openly, was 2's west face, a wall of rock and ice more than 8,000 feet high that had been climbed only once, by a vast Russian expedition that needed 11 climbers, 7 camps, and fixed ropes strung over 10 weeks. Hiraide and Nakajima intended to climb a brand new line up that same face in pure alpine style. No oxygen, no porters, no fixed ropes, no camps stocked in advance. Just 2 men and what they could carry on their backs on the hardest wall on the mountain. A plan a fellow climber called astounding in both scale and steepness. It was one of the boldest lines ever attempted on K2. On July 27, 2024, on their 4th day of climbing, the pair fell from around 7,500 meters. A Pakistani rescue helicopter spotted 2 motionless figures on the west face, but could not land that high, and a second flight confirmed there was no movement at all. The terrain was far too steep and broken to reach on foot, and so, with their family's consent, the search was called off. There was no storm, no crowd, no scandal, no dramatic rescue gone wrong. Just 2 of the finest climbers alive, attempting the hardest thing on the mountain and simply not coming home. Hiraide had once said it was Nakajima's fearlessness that let him keep climbing at all, because he himself had lost that innocence and grown afraid of the mountains. In the end, the fearless one and the frightened one went together. So when you lay these 5 stories side by side, a clear picture begins to form, and it is not about bad luck or bad decisions. It is about how we choose to remember a mountain. We build our memory of a place like K2 around catastrophe, around the seasons with the highest body counts and the disasters big enough to argue about for decades. Call it the body count bias, the quiet rule that says a death only becomes a story if enough people die at once, or if something scandalous went wrong and there was somebody to blame. A single climber doing everything right and dying anyway does not fit that shape, and so it slips through. And these 5 deaths break that rule completely. A solo master killed on flat ground, a partner watching his friends slide away into the dark, a rescuer dying to save someone else, a guide who could not find the tents in the storm, and 2 of the very best in the world, gone in silence on the hardest wall they could find. None of them left behind a scandal big enough to remember, and so, one by one, we let them go. Now, notice what almost all of them have in common. It is not the summit itself, it is the descent, and the moment right after the hardest part is done, when the guard comes down and the mountain does its quietest work. Casarotto on the glacier, Piotrowski coming off the south face, Untch heading down, Zavka trying to get home in the dark. Every single one of them had already done the hard thing. Every single one died on the way back, or died helping someone else get back, in a moment that felt, just briefly, like the danger was finally behind them. That is exactly what the famous disaster stories never managed to capture. Put it in perspective. The single most catastrophic day on this mountain killed a handful of people in a few hours and became a legend. These 5 men died across nearly 40 years, one at a time, and together they barely fill a paragraph. The mountain does not need a storm, or a crowd, or a scandal to take you. Sometimes all it needs is 1 hour of flat ground, or 1 loose crampon, or 1 lamp lit a few minutes too late. None of these 5 men died because they were reckless, or unskilled, or out of their depth. They died because on a mountain like K2, the most dangerous moment is often the quietest one, when you finally let yourself believe that you have made it. That is the part I cannot stop thinking about. and it is the reason I wanted to pull these 5 out of the footnotes and put them somewhere they might actually be seen. Casarotto, Piotrowski, Untch, Zavka, Hiraide and Nakajima. 6 men, 5 stories, and 1 mountain that took them all without ever making a sound. So, here's my question for you. Of these 5, whose death do you think deserves to be the most remembered, and why has it been so easy for the climbing world to let all of them fade? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.